Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into another day in history?
Absolutely. Always excited to see where these journeys through time take us.
So today is September 29th, and you know we love finding those quirky anniversaries. But this time, we're doing something a little different, right?
Definitely. Instead of one biography or event, we're looking at 3 distinct stories from September 29th across history.
Yeah, and showing how, even though they seem totally separate at first, they're all connected in some pretty surprising ways.
Because that's the thing about history, it's not just a bunch of separate events, it's all a web. A giant, fascinating web.
Exactly. So buckle up, because our first story takes us back to 15th century England and a battle for the throne with a very unusual name.
The Battle of Blore Heath.
Yeah.
Catchy, right?
Oh, very catchy. Okay, so imagine England in the 1450s. It's the middle of the War of the Roses.
Yeah, think Game of Thrones level drama, but with even more complicated family trees and probably worse hygiene.
Probably. So we've got the Yorks and the Lancasters, both with a claim to the throne, constantly at each other's throats. Blore Heath is just one battle in this decades-long conflict.
And it might not be as famous as some of the other battles, but it's crucial because it really shifted the power dynamic early on in the war.
Right. We've got Richard of York leading his troops against the Lancastrian forces under Lord Audley. And this Lord Audley, he's no pushover. He's got experience, a larger force. Doesn't look good for Richard.
Exactly. But what's fascinating about Blore Heath is how Richard used the terrain to his advantage. See, the battle took place on a hillside next to a field of blooming heather.
And I'm guessing that heather is more significant than just a pretty backdrop.
You bet, Richard, he's outnumbered, right? So he hides a chunk of his army in the heather. The Lancastrians charge in, thinking they've got the advantage, and bam, ambush.
Classic military tactic, but still effective centuries later.
Absolutely. And what's even more interesting is how this relatively small battle had massive ripple effects. The Yorkist victory at Blore Heath, it emboldened Richard, leading to even more support for his claim. And that ultimately paves the way for his son, Edward, to take the throne as Edward IV.
So this seemingly insignificant skirmish on a hillside in England ends up changing the course of English history. That's wild.
It really goes to show sometimes it's the battles you don't expect that have the biggest impact, right?
Totally. Which is a good segue into our next story, which, fast forward a couple of centuries, brings us to the world of, wait for it, microorganisms.
Not what you'd expect after a medieval battle, right? But trust me, it'll make sense. Today, in 1860, marks the day Louis Pasteur presented his findings that finally disproved the theory of spontaneous generation.
Okay, for those of us who weren't bio majors, spontaneous generation, what was that all about?
Basically, people thought living things could just pop into existence from non-living matter, like maggots on meat. They thought that just happened. Poof.
Oh, like people thought that meat could just magically create flies.
Yeah, exactly. And for centuries, nobody really challenged this idea.
Until Pasteur and his experiments, I'm guessing.
Right. He designed this elegant experiment with these swan-necked flasks, proving that microorganisms didn't just appear out of nowhere. Contamination had to come from pre-existing microorganisms in the air.
Okay, so back to this idea of unexpected impact. I mean, a scientist disproving a theory, that's cool, but how did that impact, well, anything really?
Oh, this was huge. Pasteur's work, it wasn't just about those flasks, it was the foundation for modern germ theory, which revolutionized medicine and hygiene. And without germ theory, we wouldn't have things that we take for granted today, like vaccines or antibiotics.
Wow. I mean, talk about an unexpected impact from what seems like a small discovery.
It's like Blore Heath. Right. These seemingly insignificant moments can have monumental consequences.
Absolutely. Okay, ready for our final story. This one takes us to the streets of 1950s Montgomery, Alabama.
And it involves a boycott, but maybe not the kind you're thinking of.
You're right. On September 29, 1955, black taxi drivers in Montgomery began refusing to pick up white passengers.
Now remember, this is 2.5 years before the more widely known Montgomery bus boycott. So when we think about events like that, which we all know had this enormous impact on the civil rights movement.
Right, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., the whole world was watching.
Exactly. But what many people don't realize is that those later events, they were heavily influenced and even made possible by actions like this earlier taxi boycott.
So these taxi drivers were on the front line even before the bus boycott.
Absolutely. This boycott, it lasted for about a week, and while it didn't completely desegregate the taxis, it did demonstrate the power of collective action within the Black community. It proved that they could organize and fight back against injustice.
And you're saying this directly paved the way for the success of the bus boycott a couple of years later.
Absolutely. See, the taxi boycott brought to light the existing networks of community organization. Plus, it showed the economic impact a boycott could have. So, by the time Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, the Black community in Montgomery was more ready, more organized, and more unified.
Wow, I never knew that. It just goes to show how much we don't know about history and how even small acts of defiance can have these huge ripple effects.
And it connects back to both our previous stories, right? The idea that events, big or small, can have these unintended consequences that shape the world.
Absolutely. So from a seemingly minor battle in 15th century England to a scientist and his flasks to taxi drivers in Alabama, it turns out September 29th has had quite the impact on history, and in ways we never would expect it.
It really makes you think, what will future generations look back on and see as turning points in our own time?
That's a great question. And on that note, we're out of time. But thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the past.
Always a pleasure exploring with you.
Until next time, keep those historical wheels turning. Who knows what connections you might uncover in your own explorations. See you next time.